US Secretary of State John Kerry says Russia and the US have agreed to talk with the government in Kiev to overcome the crisis in Ukraine. Kerry met his Russian counterpart Sergey Lavrov in Paris. John Kerry said both sides have suggestions on how to de-escalate the crisis.
We also agreed to work with the Ukrainian government and the people to implement the steps that they are taking to assure the following priorities: the rights of national minorities, language rights, demobilization and disarmament of irregular forces and provocateurs, an inclusive constitutional reform process, and free and fair elections monitored by the international community.
Nadim Baba is live for us in Paris. And Nadim, what did the Secretary of State say?
Well, we just heard him outlining some aims which are shared by both the United States and Russia. Those are fairly broad aims, really. Free and fair elections, protecting the rights of minorities in Ukraine. But he also, in a question and answer session, did say that he'd strongly emphasized to Sergey Lavrov that the United States continues to consider Russia's actions over the last few weeks illegitimate. That's perhaps a hint at the annexation of the Crimea Peninsula, but he didn't say anything specifically about Crimea. What he did say was that both Russia and the United States now are exploring ways in which the troop mobilization around Ukraine's border with Russia could actually be withdrawn, or rather reduced, ahead of being perhaps withdrawn. He didn't give us any detail, but that's really interesting as a sign of perhaps an area where Russia might be willing to make a gesture. Of course, people in Kiev, the government in Kiev, would say that's a very weak gesture, but at the moment it seems to be as far as the US is prepared to go.
This meeting was called very hastily. In fact, Mr. Kerry diverted his plane, didn't he? But there doesn't seem to be any sign of whether or not any progress was made or not.
You're right. I think the only progress that John Kerry in the last half an hour has really been able to show is that Russia and America have continued to talk to each other, keeping in mind the interests of the whole of Ukraine. He did admit that Russia's opinion on, for example, subjects like federalization is important because, as he said, Russia has long ties with the country, and particularly the south and the east, where there are many Russian speakers. He said that there will be more consultations involving the US, Russia and Ukraine, but nothing about direct talks between Moscow and the Kiev government. And I think that's crucial, because his main message, which he repeated many times, was nothing can be decided without Ukraine's involvement. Ukraine, when he refers to it, is basically the interim government in place in Kiev. So it's a really tricky situation, Stephen.
It still is. Nadim Baba in Paris. Thanks, Nadim. Let's go to Washington and Alan Fisher there. The whole point of this was to, in that clumsy phrase, de-escalate the crisis, but no signs of any de-escalation officially.
Well, I think if you look at what John Kerry has said just in the last 20 minutes or so, when the Russians are talking about federalization and the protection of minorities, it seems that he has said to the Russians, well, you've got a point. Yeah, we need to think about these things going forward for Ukraine, but nothing happens until you start to move your troops away from the border, because that creates an atmosphere where talks really can't go ahead. So it'll be interesting to see what the next move from the Russians would be. And certainly John Kerry can say everything is on the table, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide. The Ukrainians have said, look, there can be no federalization. Russia talks about itself being a federation, and yet it suppresses many of the things it's telling us that we need to implement here. But we all know that if the Americans were keen on the idea, they could nudge the Ukrainians towards the solution that it sees. So when it says that it's up to the Ukrainians to decide, yes, that's correct, but the Americans do have a great deal of influence. How do we know that? Well, when Sergey Lavrov sat down to talk about the future of Ukraine, there wasn't a Ukrainian in the room. John Kerry was calling the Prime Minister in Kiev to talk about what was going on, and it was the United States that was actually having the discussions in Paris. So there's probably room for manoeuvre, but I think John Kerry has said in his frank discussions, which lasted for 4 hours, he said to the Russians, look, troops away from the border first, and then everything could possibly be on the table as long as the Ukrainians get to have a say in what their future would be. And that could possibly be a referendum on federalisation. If the people say, yes, that's what we want, then who are the Ukrainian government to oppose that, particularly if the Americans say, look, this is what you've talked yourselves into.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Many thanks indeed for that from Alan Fisher, Washington, D.C.